The barn wedding debacle. The morning didn't start the way mornings usually did on Ethan Caldwell's farm. There were no birds chirping outside his window, no rooster crowing to announce the dawn. Instead, Ethan jolted awake to the harsh, grating sound of power drills tearing through the stillness. It wasn't a subtle noise. It was the kind that set your teeth on edge, like nails scraping metal. For a moment, he lay there, blinking at the cracked wooden ceiling of his bedroom, trying to make sense of it. His first thought was immediate and primal: someone stealing my barn. The idea wasn't as far-fetched as it might sound. Ethan's barn wasn't just any old structure. It was a sturdy, weathered beauty built by his grandfather decades ago, with wide beams and a high roof that had weathered storms and time alike. It wasn't flashy, but it had character, and out here in the rural stretch of Willow Creek, that kind of thing could catch the wrong kind of attention. His second thought, however, hit closer to home: Lydia. Ethan threw off the quilt, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. He didn't waste time pulling on a shirt, just yanked on his worn work boots, grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, and stormed outside. The crisp March air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the barn, 100 yards from the house, where the noise was coming from. And there she was. Lydia Harper, his neighbor from hell, stood in the middle of his barn like she owned the deed to it. She was barking orders at a team of workers, her voice sharp and commanding over the whine of the drills. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the scene. Long tables were being hauled in through the wide double doors. String lights were being draped across the rafters, twinkling faintly even in the morning light. And right next to his neatly stacked hay bales stood a massive floral arch, dripping with roses and greenery, the kind of thing you'd see in a bridal magazine. Lydia turned at the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel, a perfectly manicured hand landing on her hip. "Oh, good morning, Ethan," she chirped, her tone so syrupy sweet it could have rotted teeth. "Isn't it just the perfect day for a wedding?" Ethan stared at her, his brain scrambling to catch up with the sheer absurdity of what he was seeing. A wedding. In his barn. "Lydia," he said, his voice bouncing off the barn walls, rough with sleep and disbelief. "What the hell is this?" She gave a dramatic sigh, as if he were the one being unreasonable. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Ethan. It's just one day. You weren't even using the space, and besides, I already sent out the invitations." She waved a dismissive hand, turning back to direct a worker who was struggling with a tablecloth. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked around again, really taking it in this time. This wasn't some casual backyard get-together. This was a full-blown, high-end wedding, catered, decorated, planned down to the last detail. And it was happening on his property without so much as a "by your leave." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Lydia, I didn't agree to this," he said, his voice low, barely holding back the anger bubbling up. "That's just a technicality," she replied breezily, not even looking at him. "The mayor said it'd be such a lovely venue, and you know how much the town loves a big event. It's good for the community, Ethan." There it was, the trump card. Lydia was a fixture in Willow Creek, always cozying up to the right people, always getting her way. She had the mayor's ear, the town council's favor, and a knack for twisting anything into a community benefit. Ethan, on the other hand, was just a farmer, a guy with a barn, a few acres, and a herd of goats. Who was going to take his side over hers? "Lydia, you can't just take over my property," he tried again, stepping closer. But she'd already turned away, her attention back on the workers, directing them like a general in designer heels. Ethan stood there, his breath fogging in the chilly air, and realized something. There was no stopping this. No amount of yelling, no amount of reasoning was going to undo what she'd set in motion. The wedding was happening, whether he liked it or not. But that didn't mean he had to play nice. "Fine," he said, loud enough for her to hear. She glanced back, flashing him a fake smile. "Have your wedding. Enjoy the barn." Her smile widened, triumphant. "See? I knew you'd come around. I'll even save you a piece of cake." Ethan didn't respond. He just turned on his heel and walked away, his mind already spinning with ideas. If Lydia wanted a wedding in his barn, she was going to get one, a wedding she'd never forget. By late afternoon, Ethan's barn didn't look like his barn anymore. The workers had worked fast, and the place was transformed. White drapes hung from the rafters, softening the rough edges of the wood. Fairy lights twinkled everywhere, casting a warm glow over the space. The tables were set with pristine white linens, silverware gleaming under the soft light. It was beautiful, Ethan had to admit, straight out of one of those glossy magazines Lydia probably spent her evenings flipping through. The only problem? It wasn't supposed to be here. Ethan watched from a distance, leaning against the split-rail fence that separated his pasture from the barn. He chewed on a piece of straw, his arms crossed, taking it all in. Lydia pranced around in a pastel dress, her blonde hair swept up in some elaborate style, making sure every detail was perfect. Guests were starting to arrive now, fancy cars pulling up along his dirt driveway, kicking up dust as they parked. Men in suits and women in dresses stepped out, looking out of place against the backdrop of his muddy fields. The groom, poor bastard, stood off to the side, fidgeting with his tie. He was a lanky guy, maybe mid-30s, with a nervous energy that made Ethan wonder if he even wanted to be here. If he had any sense, he'd be running for the hills. But then again, marrying Lydia probably meant he'd already lost any chance at sense. Ethan wasn't going to stop the wedding. That would have been too simple, too direct. No, he had something better in mind, something that would make Lydia regret ever setting foot on his land. And it started with his goats. Most people didn't realize just how much chaos a goat could cause when it wanted to. Ethan's herd wasn't your average bunch of docile farm animals. They were a rowdy, mischievous crew, led by a big, scruffy billy goat named Brutus. Brutus was the king of trouble, stubborn, fearless, and always up for a good time. Ethan made his way to the goat enclosure, a rickety pen about 50 yards from the barn. Brutus was already watching him, his yellow eyes glinting with interest. "Want to have some fun, buddy?" Ethan asked, crouching down to meet the goat's gaze. Brutus snorted, stomping a hoof in the dirt. "Good," Ethan said, a slow grin spreading across his face. Because Lydia's about to have the worst wedding of her life. Back at the barn, the ceremony was starting. Lydia stood at the wide double doors, looking like royalty surveying her kingdom. The officiant, a balding man in a black suit, was droning on about love and commitment, his voice carrying over the soft sniffles of the guests. The groom stood stiffly beside her, looking 2 seconds away from fainting. It was the perfect moment. Ethan unlatched the gate to the goat pen. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Brutus trotted out, head held high, like he knew exactly what was expected of him. A murmur rippled through the guests as he sauntered into the barn, his hooves clacking on the wooden floor. Lydia turned, her fake smile freezing as she spotted him. And then the rest came. Brutus led the charge, a dozen goats storming into the barn like a fluffy, 4-legged wrecking crew. They barreled down the aisle, knocking over the floral arch with a crash. Petals scattered everywhere as guests shrieked, clutching their dresses and ties. The goats didn't stop there. They made a beeline for the buffet table, a glorious spread of cheeses, fruits, and pastries that had been set up along the far wall. A woman screamed as a goat, little Daisy, the sneakiest of the bunch, snatched her handbag and bolted. Another guest tried to shoo Brutus away, only to have the big goat leap onto his lap, knocking over a glass of champagne. Lydia lost it. "Ethan!" she shrieked, whirling around to find him. Her face was redder than the punch bowl, her eyes wild with fury. Ethan leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Oh, sorry, Lydia," he called over the chaos. "Guess they were just curious. You know how animals are." "Get them out," she screeched, but it was too late. The goats had reached the dance floor. Daisy, ever the overachiever, leaped onto the DJ table, sending speakers crashing to the ground. The music cut out with a harsh screech. The groom tried to grab Brutus's collar, only to get head-butted in the stomach and go down with a groan. Lydia's dress, once pristine, was now streaked with hay and goat slobber. She grabbed a chair and hurled it at Brutus. The goat dodged with a nimble sidestep, but Lydia wasn't so lucky. Brutus lunged, snagging her flower crown and ripping it clean off her head. The guests were in full panic mode now, scrambling for safety. The best man tried to help Lydia, only to trip over Daisy and land face first in the wedding cake. A towering, 3-tiered monstrosity that collapsed under his weight. Ethan watched it all unfold, the chaos spreading like wildfire, and couldn't help but feel a deep, satisfying sense of justice. "Looks like your big day's really kicking off," he shouted over the noise. Lydia whipped around, fuming, but before she could fire back, Brutus reared up and head-butt her right in the backside. She went flying, landing with a spectacular splash in the remains of the cake. The barn fell silent for a split second, the guests frozen in shock. Then someone snorted, a single, glorious laugh that spread through the crowd like a contagion. Even the groom was chuckling, brushing cake off his suit as he climbed to his feet. Lydia wasn't laughing. She was out for blood, and something told Ethan this night was far from over. The chaos from the ceremony settled into an uneasy lull, but the damage was done. Lydia, covered in cake and goat slobber, was a mess, her pastel dress ruined, her hair a tangle of missing chunks where Brutus had taken his victory nibbles. The guests were trying to regain some semblance of normalcy, brushing hay and frosting off their expensive outfits. A few had already slipped out, probably deciding no wedding was worth this level of disaster. But Lydia wasn't giving up. She wasn't the type to let her perfect day fail without a fight. She stormed up to Ethan, her heels sinking into the barn floor with every furious step. Her dress was a wreck, sporting hoof prints and a torn hem, and her face was a mask of pure murder. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, jabbing a manicured finger into his chest. Ethan smirked, unfazed. "A little bit, yeah." Her nostrils flared, and for a moment, he thought she might actually charge him like one of his goats. "You are going to fix this," she snapped. "You are going to get rid of those filthy animals, and you are going to make sure my wedding goes back to being perfect." Ethan glanced over her shoulder at the wreckage. The DJ was still trying to salvage his equipment, but Daisy had claimed the sound system as her throne, standing triumphantly atop a speaker. The best man was picking cake out of his eyebrows, muttering curses under his breath. The buffet table was a lost cause, the remaining food now the property of Ethan's very full, very satisfied goats. He shrugged. "Looks pretty perfect to me." Lydia let out a noise somewhere between a scream and a growl, but before she could launch into a full tirade, one of her bridesmaids came running up, breathless. "Lydia, the caterers are refusing to bring out the main course until the goats are gone." Lydia whirled back to Ethan, her eyes blazing. "Get them out." He could have argued. He could have played dumb, pretended he didn't know how to wrangle his own animals, dragged this out until she was frothing at the mouth. But Ethan wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "All right," he said, relenting with a sigh. He gave a sharp whistle, and the goats, recognizing the signal, began to retreat. Brutus, of course, took his sweet time, pausing to knock over the last remaining centerpiece before trotting off after the others. Lydia exhaled, smoothing down what was left of her dress as she tried to collect herself. "Finally," she muttered. "Now we can get back on track." Oh, if only she knew. With the goats finally corralled back into their pen, Brutus giving Ethan a smug look as if to say, "We'll be back," the wedding stumbled into its next phase. The barn staff, a harried group of caterers and decorators Lydia had no doubt bullied into submission, scrambled to clean up the mess. They swept away the scattered petals, righted the overturned chairs, and mopped up the champagne-soaked floorboards. The scent of hay and goat lingered, a stubborn reminder of the earlier chaos, but Lydia was determined to press on. Ethan pulled up a chair at one of the side tables, a battered wooden thing that hadn't been claimed by the pristine wedding setup. He leaned back, sipping a warm beer he'd snagged from his own fridge before rejoining the spectacle. From here, he had a perfect view of Lydia, now seated at the head of the main table, her glare boring into him from across the barn. Every time their eyes met, her expression darkened, but Ethan just raised his bottle in a mock toast and took another sip. She could glare all she wanted. He wasn't the one who'd turned his barn into a circus. The dinner portion resumed with forced smiles and awkward small talk. The guests, some still shaken from having their purses snatched or their suits trampled by hooves, picked at their appetizers, little squares of cheese and fruit that had somehow survived the goat invasion. The caterers, after much cajoling from Lydia's shrill demands, finally wheeled out the main course, platters of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans glistening with butter. It smelled good, Ethan had to admit, but he wasn't about to join the feast. He'd rather eat dirt than touch anything Lydia had a hand in. The speeches began as the plates were cleared. The father of the bride, a portly man with a red face and a too-tight suit, stood first. He cleared his throat, raising a glass of wine that trembled slightly in his hand. "Well," he began, his voice booming over the murmur of the crowd, "I think we can all agree this has been a memorable evening." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the guests, a few glancing toward Ethan as if he might unleash another surprise. "But what matters most is that my daughter, Lydia, is marrying the man of her dreams. A love like this is rare, and nothing, not even a few unexpected hiccups, can take away from the beauty of this day." Ethan's eyes slid to the groom, whose name he'd overheard was Nathan. The guy wasn't smiling. In fact, he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, his shoulders hunched, his fingers twisting the napkin in his lap into knots. Nathan's face was pale, his dark hair sticking to his forehead, with sweat despite the cool evening air filtering through the barn's open doors. Ethan couldn't help but wonder, "What's your story, buddy?" If this was the man of Lydia's dreams, he sure didn't look like he was living the dream himself. As the father droned on about love and commitment, Ethan noticed something else. Nathan's best man, a wiry guy with a crooked tie and cake still smeared on his sleeve, kept shooting Nathan's sidelong glances. There was a tension there, a silent conversation Ethan couldn't quite decipher. Whatever it was, it didn't bode well for Lydia's picture-perfect night. Dinner wrapped up with the unveiling of the dance floor, a cleared space in the center of the barn where the DJ had set up his salvaged equipment. The guy looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour, his hands shaking as he adjusted the speakers Daisy had nearly destroyed. But he got the music going, a soft, romantic ballad that filled the barn with a saccharine melody. Lydia, ever the determined bride, grabbed Nathan's hand and dragged him to the center of the floor. The guests gathered around, phones out, ready to capture the magic of the first dance. Lydia rested her head on Nathan's shoulder, her eyes closed as if she could will the chaos of the day away. For a moment, it almost worked. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and she looked like the radiant bride she'd no doubt spent months imagining herself to be. Nathan, though, was stiff as a board, his arms barely holding her, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. And that's when Ethan decided it was time for round two. He slipped out of his chair and made his way back to the goat pen, moving quietly so as not to draw attention. Brutus was waiting, his head tilted as if he'd been expecting this. "Ready for an encore?" Ethan muttered, unlatching the gate again. The goats didn't need much encouragement. Brutus trotted out first, followed by Daisy, Buttons, and the rest of the crew. Ethan stayed back this time, watching from the shadows as they made their move. It started subtly. Brutus sauntered onto the dance floor, his hooves clicking against the wood. A few guests murmured, some chuckling, assuming it was just a harmless little accident. Then Daisy darted in, followed by Buttons, and within seconds, all hell broke loose. Brutus, bold as ever, charged straight into the couple, head-butting Nathan in the back of the knees. Nathan went down like a felled tree, taking Lydia with him in a tangle of white tulle and flailing limbs. Gasps filled the barn as Lydia let out a high-pitched screech, thrashing to free herself from her massive dress. One of the bridesmaids, a tall girl in a lavender gown, made the mistake of stepping in to help. Daisy promptly yanked her shoe off her foot and bolted, the heel dangling from her mouth like a trophy. The best man lunged for Buttons, trying to grab the goat's collar, only to be dragged across the floor in a humiliating skid. The DJ, proving he'd reached his breaking point, threw up his hands and bolted for the exit, abandoning his gear entirely. The music cut out mid-note, replaced by the clatter of hooves and Lydia's shrieks of rage. Buttons, in a moment of pure brilliance, leaped onto the remains of the buffet table, sending plates and glasses crashing to the ground. The guests scattered, some climbing onto tables, others shielding their faces as if under attack. Brutus, not to be outdone, found his way to the DJ table and, with a mighty stomp of his hoof, brought the speakers back to life. But instead of the soft ballad, it was an obnoxiously upbeat dance track, something with a pounding bass line that turned the barn into a full-on goat disco. Lydia, her face crimson with fury, screamed over the noise. "Ethan, I swear to." But before she could finish, Brutus had butt her again, sending her straight into the punch bowl. The table tipped, and a wave of sticky red liquid splashed over her, soaking her dress and pooling on the floor. The barn went silent, the guests staring in stunned disbelief. Lydia sat there, drenched, her white gown now a garish crime scene of punch and cake. Someone snorted. Then another. And then the entire barn erupted into laughter. Uncontrollable, rolling waves of it. Even Nathan, sprawled on the floor beside her, was chuckling, wiping tears from his eyes as he struggled to catch his breath. Lydia whipped around, staring at him in betrayal. "You're laughing? This is our wedding." Nathan, still gasping between chuckles, wiped his face. "Lydia, I think this might be a sign." Her mouth fell open. A sign of what? He hesitated, then stood, brushing hay off his suit. In front of everyone, he said the words that sealed her fate. "A sign that maybe we shouldn't be doing this." The silence that followed Nathan's declaration was deafening. The guests froze, their laughter dying in their throats as they exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their seats, unsure whether to stay or bolt for the exit. Nathan stood tall despite his disheveled appearance. Hay in his hair, punch stains on his shirt, looking at Lydia with a mix of regret and resolve. Lydia, still on the floor, punch dripping from her dress, stared up at him, her face pale, as if the world had just tilted off its axis. Lydia's mother, Margaret, a stern woman with the same sharp features and entitled air as her daughter, was the first to react. She shot up from her chair, her heels clicking furiously as she marched toward Nathan. "What do you mean, you're not sure?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Explain yourself, young man." Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I can't do this. I've had doubts for weeks, months, even, and today just made it clear that this isn't right." His voice was steady now, calmer than it had any right to be. "This whole wedding has been about what Lydia wanted, what her family wanted, what looked perfect on the outside. But none of it feels real. And honestly, if this," he gestured at the wreckage around them, "the goats still milling about like they owned the place, is what our future looks like, then I don't want it." Lydia scrambled to her feet, her soaked dress clinging to her legs, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. "You can't be serious," she shrieked. "You're breaking up with me at our wedding?" She took a step toward him, her eyes wild. "This is all his fault." She whirled toward Ethan, who was still leaning against the barn wall, arms crossed, entirely unbothered. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Now, Lydia, I think you did that all on your own." Her face contorted, a mix of rage and desperation. "You did this on purpose. You ruined my wedding. You set your disgusting animals loose because you're a bitter, miserable farmer who hates happiness." Ethan pushed off the wall, taking a slow step toward her. "You mean the wedding you decided to have in my barn without asking? The one you planned on my property like I didn't even exist? The one where you ignored every chance to back off and then acted shocked when it didn't go your way?" He tilted his head, watching her fury waver. "Sounds to me like karma just RSVP'd." A few guests, who'd been biting their tongues all night, let out muffled chuckles. Margaret spun on them, her glare venomous enough to silence a crowd, and they quickly sobered up. But Nathan didn't laugh. He looked tired, exhausted, really, like a man who'd just woken up from a long, suffocating dream. Lydia turned back to him, her voice dropping to a softer, pleading tone. "Babe, you don't mean this. You're just overwhelmed. We've put too much into this for you to walk away now." He shook his head, stepping back to put some distance between them. "That's just it, Lydia. It was always we put too much into this, but it was never really we. It was you. You decided everything, every detail, every choice. You even picked my suit without asking." He let out a dry laugh, gesturing at the wrinkled, stained mess he was wearing. "And let's not forget you forced this wedding into a man's barn without permission. Who does that?" Lydia opened her mouth to argue, but for once, words failed her. She turned to the guests, her eyes darting around for support. "Are you really going to let this happen?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Somebody say something." But no one did. Not even her family seemed eager to jump in. Some guests sipped their drinks awkwardly, others stared at the floor, suddenly fascinated by the hay-strewn boards. A few were already edging toward the door, sensing the night had crossed into unsalvageable territory. Nathan exhaled, glancing at his best man, who gave him a small, approving nod. I should have done this before, he admitted. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. He moved steadily out of the barn, past the scattered decorations, through the muddy path to the parking area. Some guests followed, whispering among themselves, leaving Lydia standing alone in the wreckage. For a moment, she didn't move. Then reality hit her like a tidal wave. No, 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 she shrieked, chasing after him. You don't get to walk away from me. We're getting married. You can't just. But Nathan didn't stop. He kept going, his silhouette disappearing into the dusk as car engines started up behind him. Lydia turned back to Ethan, her chest heaving. I hope you're happy, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. Ethan shrugged, glancing at Brutus, who was happily chewing on what was left of her bouquet. Not as happy as Brutus, he said. Her face twisted in fury, but there was nothing left to say. She stomped past him, shoving chairs out of her way, her dress dragging behind her like a ruined specter. Margaret hurried after her, her heels sinking into the dirt, while the remaining guests scattered like startled birds. Within 10 minutes, the barn was empty. The only sounds the soft shuffling of the goats, the faint hum of the wind, and the occasional crunch of a centerpiece being repurposed as a snack. Ethan took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. It was over. Finally, Ethan stood in the middle of his barn, surveying the aftermath. The fairy lights still twinkled faintly, though half of them were dangling loose from the rafters. The tables were a mess of spilled food and broken glass, the dance floor scuffed and stained with punch. It'd take him a full day to clean this up, maybe 2, but it was worth it. Lydia had strutted in thinking she could take whatever she wanted, leave him to deal with the fallout, and walk away unscathed. But life didn't work like that, not on his farm. Brutus trotted up to him, nudging his arm with a bleat. Ethan reached down, scratching the goat behind the ears. You did good, buddy. Real good. The rest of the herd milled around, some still nibbling on scraps of flowers or fabric they'd claimed as spoils of war. He'd have to round them up properly soon, but for now, he let them enjoy their victory. Just as he turned to head inside for the night, he heard footsteps behind him. Ethan glanced back, surprised to see Nathan standing there, hands in his pockets, looking sheepish. The groom's suit was a disaster. Hay stuck to the fabric, punch stains streaking the white shirt, but there was a lightness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I just wanted to say thanks, Nathan said after a moment, his voice quiet but genuine. Ethan smirked. So what you're saying is my goats saved you? Nathan laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, guess they did. He paused, kicking at a clump of dirt with his shoe. I've been trying to find a way out for weeks. Lydia, she's a force of nature, you know? Once she sets her mind to something, there's no stopping her. I kept telling myself I could handle it, that it'd get better after the wedding. But tonight, he gestured at the barn, the chaos still fresh in the air. Tonight made it clear I was kidding myself. Ethan nodded, leaning against a post. Sounds like you dodged a bullet. More like a whole stampede, Nathan said with a grin. He glanced back toward the road, where the last of the cars were pulling away. Anyway, I owe you one. If you ever need anything, help fixing this place up, a beer, whatever, just let me know. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan said. Nathan gave him a final nod, a grateful glance, and walked off toward his car. Ethan watched the taillights disappear down the road, then turned back to the barn. Brutus bleated again, louder this time, as if demanding some grand conclusion to the night. Ethan patted his head. Come on, let's get you all some extra hay. You earned it. With that, he headed toward the feed shed, the goats trailing behind him like a victorious army. The night settled into a peaceful quiet, the kind Ethan hadn't felt in a while. Lydia was gone, her wedding in shambles, and for the first time in a long time, he'd come out on top. It wasn't just about the barn or the goats. It was about standing his ground, about reminding people like Lydia that the world didn't bend to their whims. And as he tossed handfuls of hay into the pen, watching Brutus and the others dig in, he couldn't help but smile. He'd won.